Today's scripture is Ruth chapter 2, verses 14 to 19. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her, and from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, saying, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." This is the word of the Lord.
So a couple of years ago, my daughter came to me and asked, "Dad, how much do you normally spend on our birthday parties?" And I'm like, "Why do you ask?" And she's like, "Well, I have an idea. How about this year, instead of throwing me a birthday party, you just give me the money and drive me and my friends to the mall?" At which point I'm like, sold. I love that plan. Far less work for me. And so that has become the tradition, and it ended up being last Friday, a couple of days ago, was that day that I was blessed to drive a bunch of teenagers and that like to sing show tunes to the mall in Broomfield and drop them off for a few hours. The blessing for me in that was anytime I get to spend time with my daughter and her friends, of course, that's good times. But I also got to continue to drive south after I kicked them out of the car and head down to Golden, where my friend Susan is the pastor there. So Susan and I have known each other for a long time. She was one of the other clergy in Billings when I first arrived there way back in 2010 to serve my church. And one of Susan's spiritual gifts is definitely the gift of hospitality. And when she first arrived amongst the clergy in Montana and amongst the clergy in Billings specifically, she did not feel like she was all that well greeted, and people did not show her the kind of hospitality from her colleagues that she would have liked to seen. And so she decided to take it upon herself to make sure that anybody else new who came in would experience the kind of welcome that she herself wanted to receive, which I thought was a very kind of positive spin to put on the whole thing. And so she greeted me and Dane, and we were actually pregnant with Vivian at the time we showed up, and we got to journey together through ministry there for several years. And then, as happens sometimes in the church, she went one place and I went somewhere else. But now we find ourselves in the position that I am blessed to be here, and she is not that far away down in Golden. So I got to go spend some time with her on Friday, and I was talking about this worship series that we were putting together, and I was talking about this idea of post-traumatic growth and what it involves, and that today, that I was prepping for this sermon today, and this sermon really is about, and this week is really about, the idea of social support, right? That the way we get through things is oftentimes the most important and proud and profound way we get through things is that we don't get through them alone. We hopefully have people around us who support us and care about us. And as I was sitting there talking to Susan, I got the opportunity to share with her how much her support over the years has meant to me, and especially in those months following the passing of my wife. Now, Susan was one because she happened to be close by. She was there very, very early on, that first day, just to show up and be present and give a hug, because that is really all you can do at that time. And as we kind of moved through the days and the weeks to follow, Susan would continue to check in with me and call and text and do those things that you do. And eventually we got to this point where I realized I couldn't spend the rest of my life at home, even though that felt like a tempting option. Right? You're like, I'm eventually going to have to leave this house again. And I'm like, how on earth am I going to do that? And it was about that time that Susan called and said, do you want to get some lunch? And I'm like, that sounds great. Let's eat lunch somewhere where I won't run into anybody else I know. So not in Johnstown. So we would meet up, and we kind of halfway in between, down somewhere in like the Longmont area or whatever, and we would have lunch. And I told her how important those lunches were to me, and she shared a couple of things that I had not known. And she said, I realized that I couldn't do much. It didn't feel like I could do much, but the one thing I could do is keep in contact. The one thing I could do is take you to lunch. The one thing I could do is listen. And so she's like, I was intentional every couple of weeks to make sure I reached out and that we put something on the calendar and we had lunch or coffee together. And we did, looking back on it, every couple of weeks for a few months. Susan would do this for me. And then she told me, as she looked at her husband, and she's like, you should have seen him those first couple of lunches. He was basically incoherent. And she's not wrong, right? When you're in the midst of the valley, when you're in the midst of the drama, when you're still feeling the pain real in that moment, right? Coherent thought is not something that your brain is able to do all that well, because again, we talked about this in the first week, your brain is trying to make sense of something when we go through trauma. Oftentimes your brain is trying to make sense of something that is senseless. And it just basically eats up all the capacity you have. And so she also said, I needed to keep coming back to make sure that you would eventually become coherent again. And every time we got together, I could see you were a little bit more and a little bit more. And what was remarkable to me was not that observation, because I probably already knew that. What was interesting to me is when Susan said that, I never would have known in the moment we were having lunch that Susan was feeling that way. All I knew at that time and in that place, when we would gather for meals, is that here was my friend who was listening intently to what it is that I had to say, which apparently was only slightly above babbling at the time, and was nodding along and offering her care and offering her love and offering her support and just being there and being present with me. At no time, at any of the lunches that we had together, did I ever feel like I was being judged. Did I ever feel like I was being told that the feelings I was having or the emotions I was feeling at that moment were wrong? Instead, what I got was the string of affirmations and encouragement and love from a close friend, which turned out to be exactly what I needed, and truthfully is exactly what most of us need when we are moving through hard and difficult times. One of the biggest challenges when trauma enters our lives is the feeling of being alone. It's very lonely and can feel very isolating. So the people who can pierce through that loneliness, pierce through that isolation, and do nothing more than reminding us that we are, in fact, not alone, that as hard as what we are going through may feel, and as difficult as it may be, and as challenging as it may be, we are not, in fact, doing it all by ourselves. There are friends, there are family, there are people around us who care about us. And Susan embodied that, as did many others. I got lots of free lunches for several months, and I appreciated all of them. Now, we actually see a similar moment to this experience happening in the scripture today, where Ruth and Boaz finally meet and get to share a meal together. It's remarkable though it goes by rather quickly in the scripture. But some of what makes it remarkable might be a little bit lost on us. So remember last week we talked about Ruth gleaning in the fields, which was one of the only options open to her to support herself and her mother-in-law because they had no husbands, they had no children, and in that time and in that place, that puts you very low in terms of social status. And you add on top of that, Ruth is not of God's people. Ruth is a Moabite. She's from somewhere else. So she is a poor, widowed foreigner in Bethlehem. There are not much for her to do, but the one thing she can do is glean, where she goes to the fields and picks up the leftovers. And she decides, we talked about this last week, the important that she decides to look towards the one little piece of hope that she has for support for her and Naomi, which is to go to the fields and see what she can find there. She made that choice. And then as we read last week, again, she made that choice and she followed through and she worked hard. She worked very, very hard while she was there. So hard, in fact, that the regular workers took notice of how hard that she was working and reported this back to Boaz. So when Boaz finally comes and finds Ruth in the fields and sees what she is doing, he kind of has a choice to make about what he's going to do with this person. Now, he knows by God's rules at the time, he has to let her do it. That's why they allow gleaning, it is for the poor, the orphan, and the widow. But that also means it's for the people who are very low in terms of social status. And Boaz is not low in social status. He is quite the opposite. So he would be well within his rights to, one, allow this to happen, but two, be annoyed by it, or ignore it, or just say, well, good for her. I'm glad she found something, right? He could rest on those laurels and no one would judge him. And in fact, that's probably what everybody expects him to do. But instead, he does something different. He goes to Ruth and he offers to share a meal with her. It would be unique for a landowner to share meals with his own employees, his own harvesters all by themselves, let alone the random people who show up to glean the leftovers. And yet Boaz makes a different choice. He goes to Ruth and he affirms for her the hard work that he has seen her already doing. He doesn't chastise her for having to glean. He doesn't question her poor life choices that led to the situation she's currently in or anything like that. He sees what she is trying to do there and in that moment, and she chooses to affirm what she's doing, affirm the hard work and effort she's already putting in, and instead of pitying her or judging her, he offers to share a table and share a meal to make sure that she has everything that she needs. This is a transition and turning point in the story of Ruth. The first one was when Ruth chooses to go glean in the first place. And now there's another transition happening because somebody made a choice, but in this case, the person making the choice was Boaz. Boaz decides not to run away from this person who is clearly hurting, not run away from this person who's clearly gone through some stuff, not turn away from somebody who's clearly experienced some trauma, but instead decides to come alongside of her, to support her, and go above and beyond caring for her. Yes, physically, by making sure that she has the grain that she needs to feed herself and her mother-in-law, but also there is an emotional and almost spiritual kind of support happening here too. Because he's not just letting her, giving her permission to take his grain. He's sitting down, he's spending time, he's sharing a meal, he's taking the time to see what she is doing and the hard work that she is putting in. And Boaz becomes her encourager and her affirmer in the same way that Susan and countless others played for me. Boaz enters this story in a profound way. And he does it by caring for Ruth, by coming alongside of her in her difficult time. So Ruth then goes home in the story we heard, and then she goes to Naomi and says, look what happened. And don't forget, Naomi is still kind of in the spiral, right? She's still in the don't call me Naomi anymore because I'm not happy and I'm never going to be again. Naomi hasn't left the house yet, metaphorically. She probably has physically. She's still stuck in that place. But she sees Ruth come home, and she sees Ruth come home not only by herself, but come home with all of this grain and everything that was offered, and tells her the story of what had happened, no doubt telling the story about how she had been working hard, and this very kind person came and stood beside her and supported her in a way that is now not only blessing Ruth, but is blessing Naomi as well. And Naomi's response is interesting, because both in the verses we read, and if you keep reading in the next verse to come, Naomi will ask for God's blessing to be upon the man that had supported Ruth. Naomi, who had just the chapter before literally been cursing God, who had been so angry with God for what happened to her and who had happened to her daughters-in-law, right? That she would say, I can't even be called by my God-given name anymore. And yet, now here we are, after Ruth and Naomi both have experienced the grace that Boaz has offered. She's willing to open up her mind to the possibility that God is capable of blessing them even in this difficult circumstance. She is reframing her narrative. She is reframing her story, or at least starting to. She is not only focusing on the loss and the hurt and the trauma, but this is a moment where she herself is having to admit and recognize that even amidst the darkness that she feels no doubt she is in, there is still some light, there is still some love, and there is still some hope. So she's willing to shift her story a little bit. And that really is the most important thing. The stories we tell ourselves about our lives and who we are in the world are oftentimes the most important thing that we have. And one of the things that makes trauma and makes hard times is they disrupt or sometimes feel like they completely shatter the story we have for ourselves, our lives, where we've been and where we expect to go next. That's what differentiates true trauma, true hardship, from just mild or annoying inconvenience. Is it something that shifts our own personal story about who we are and where we may be headed? Naomi's story was shattered, Ruth's story was shattered, and they're having to put it back together again. And in this moment, we see Naomi open to the possibility that, yes, her story was broken, but it doesn't necessarily have to stay that way. And yes, she went through a hopeless feeling time, but that does not mean there actually is no hope. She is willing to start the process herself of reframing and rebuilding the story of her and her life. And as we continue reading, and as we will read next week, it is surprising how far that story actually ends up going. Now, there's all kinds of ways that our stories get disrupted, and we find ourselves having to reconstruct them. When I was putting this together, I was thinking through all the different times and places and people that I've gotten to walk with. One of the things, and one of the blessings, really, truly, and it is a blessing of this job, is you do get to walk people and walk with people through hardship and hard times. And you get to see them try to make sense of the senseless. And then with luck and with hope, you get to see them move into that more hopeful place on the other side. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about a guy named Will. And Will was an older gentleman in my first church that I served all the way back in 2008, the aughts, as we called them. And it was my first appointment part-time in this little church in downtown Columbus. And within the first couple of weeks after we'd met everybody, a woman came into my office, and she was concerned, and she came to me and she's like, Pastor, I just need your help. I just need your prayers. I need your support. And I'm like, oh, okay, what's going on? It's like, well, it's my husband. He's driving me crazy. And I'm like, oh no, what's going on? And of course, I'm in the midst of pastoral care and counseling class at seminary where they're providing you for all of the hard, crazy things that life's going to throw at you and all this sort of stuff. So I'm trying to recall all my theological and pastoral education about how I'm going to help this poor woman. I'm like, thinking that something horrible and tragic's going on. And he's like, well, what's going on? He's like, well, the problem is a couple of years ago, he was made to retire. I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking to myself, that sounds lovely. Got a few years on that one. And he's like, and then she went on to share, it's like, but it really hasn't been going well since then because he doesn't have anything to do. And so he just putters around the house, getting in my way and annoying me, and then I'm annoyed at him. And Pastor, I just need some patience. So could you pray that I can have some more patience? And I'm like, yes, I've often heard the adage is don't pray for patience or God will give you a reason to learn it. But I'm like, I can do that, but maybe I could talk to him too. And she's like, well, you can if you want. And I actually had not met her husband yet. He hadn't been to church in those weeks, but he happened to come the next week. So I found Will and I made sure to get a chance to meet him, introduce himself. And I said, and he talked a little about himself. And I caught him at like the cookie time after church. And I was like, oh, so I heard you retired recently. And he looked at me, he's like, well, I was made to retire. Clearly unhappy about it. And it was over the few coming weeks as I got to know Will and talk with him a little bit better, realized that for him, his work had meant a lot. And in fact, his story, the story of who he was really enmeshed into two things, his job and his family. But they were at an age where the family and the kids were long since gone, moved several states away. They didn't see them as often as they would like. Most of us can understand that. And now he didn't have work either. And finally, after a couple of months of being there, we were chatting a little bit after worship service, and he was finally willing to confess and open up just a little bit to say that he truly was feeling lost. He's like, I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing if I don't have my job. I was good at my job. And so we would talk through that, and I was like, well, what do you like doing? And he's like, I liked doing my job. I'm like, okay. The problem was his job involved sitting at a desk and his job involved playing with numbers all day. So he wasn't particularly handy. So it's not like we could use him around the church to change light bulbs. In fact, his wife told me, do not ask him to do anything maintenance related to this place if you value whatever it is you're going to put in his hands. I'm like, okay, not his gift. And so I filed that away in the back of my head, and as weeks and months went on and we started to get to know each other as a church and figure out things to do, we were starting to partner more and more with a mission center up the road, and they had a list of needs of things they needed people to do. And as I was looking through this list of needs that they had for people to do, there was one of the things that was on there is they need somebody to put some order to their records and their record keeping and maybe do a little bit of analysis around it and all that kind of stuff because they knew they were serving a lot of people, but they didn't know exactly who or how many or those sorts of things because they were just too busy doing the work. And they needed somebody to kind of clean that up. And I said, I think I know your guy. And so I took it back to Will. And I said, well, this sounds a little bit like something you used to do. And he's like, well, yeah, it does. I mean, it's like, would you be interested in going down? It's a volunteer position. They can't pay you anything, but they really kind of need like this part of their house put in order. Is that something you feel like you could do? And he's like, well, I could go take a look. I'm like, okay, why don't you go take a look? And why don't I go with you? And he's like, okay. And so we went down and they showed him all their records, both their physical records and the spreadsheets and everything. And he starts to look at it and I'm like, Will, what do you think? He looks at me, he's like, well, you're not wrong. This is a mess. And thankfully, the other person we were meeting with was also a pastor, so he knows how to take things in stride. And he's like, yeah, it is. It's kind of a mess. And it's like, what do you think they should do? What advice would you give him? And he starts to kind of list off, well, you could do this, you could do that, you could do this. And I'm like, oh, okay. Is that something you'd be interested to come back and helping with? And he's like, well, I suppose I could. And in the back of my head thinking, I know you're not busy. And I bet your wife would pack you a heck of a lunch if you got out of the house. And so he was willing to come back the next day. And of course, that group of people that was around there was just the most loving and wonderful group of people and very quickly figured out that who Will was and what he liked. And they began to know him and they began to befriend him and they began to encourage him. And they showed how appreciative they were of the work that he was able to do. And over time, he continued to get all of their numbers and all of their records and everything in order. He began to give them good reports that they could report on. He began to work with their grant writer, and would provide the information, and eventually ended up becoming a partner with the grant writer so that he was actually co-authoring the various grants that kept that ministry going. And I remember after I had not been the pastor there, I was only there for a year, but I got to go back about 6 months later, and I ran into Will, and I said, Will, how's it going? And he's like, oh, well, let me tell you. And he starts telling me all the things that are happening at that ministry and all the different ways he's been able to help and the grants they've been able to get. And he just sort of lighted up inside of me, and his wife is sitting next to him going, thank you for getting him out of the house. For Will, even something that many of us would see, and many of us probably have already or are continuing to look forward to as a joyous thing, retirement, he did not experience it as that. He, in fact, experienced it as a form of trauma. His story about who he was and the life that he led and what he was good at and how he made a difference in the world was all tied up into something that was no longer available to him. And somebody, or some group of somebody, some group of people needed to come alongside of him and show him that there was still hope, that there were still opportunities for him to give and to serve. And the thing that he discovered that he loved more than anything was, unlike his work before, in this situation where he got to volunteer and share his gifts in these ways, everyone was just so grateful. He told me that. It's like, everyone's just so grateful all the time. I'm just tired of hearing thank you. I know I do a good job. Like, we're the church, Will. Get over it. But we are the church. And this is one of the things, if not the thing, that the church exists to do. It's why we gather here together. We gather here together not to put on airs and pretend that everything is okay all the time. We gather here together to remind ourselves and remember that we are not alone. And that when life is good and joyful, we have someone to celebrate with. And when life is hard and difficult, we have someone to give us a hug and a listening ear. And to say, as hard as this may seem, just always remember you are never alone. So long as we draw air, so long as God's people continue to be God's people, as we have for thousands of years, and no doubt will for thousands of years to come, and so long as we continue to follow in the way of Jesus, Jesus himself, who loved to eat with people he wasn't supposed to eat with, he loved to offer a kind and listening ear to people, Jesus himself, who embodied all the things that we are called to embody for each other. So long as we can continue to do that, we will continue to be the church that God has called us to be. Boaz sees Ruth, her hard work and her effort. He does not pity her or judge her, but comes alongside of her to offer his care and his support. My friend Susan came into my life at a time that I needed somebody, and she pulled me into a healthier place by listening and not judging and offering her care and support and many, many countless meals. This is the church, and this is what we do for each other. This is why we are here. And when we think about the church, when the church is at its best, and when we love the church for what it does, oftentimes it's when we are doing these sorts of things for one another, for our community, for people we know, and including people we have not even met yet. If you are going through a hard time now, you are not alone. There are people who love and care about you. God loves and cares about you. God is always with you in the good and in the bad. When we can be Christ's hands and feet for each other, sometimes the most important and profound way we can do that is by showing up. Showing up to listen, showing up to love, not to judge, but to offer grace and peace.